It's nice to see everyone here. So to all our new students, there are, give or take, 420 of you new students, and all our new faculty and staff, welcome to the GSD. To all who are returning, so to all who are returning, and we are clocked up to 1,000 students this year, welcome back. And welcome all to this evening's event, celebrating the start of the semester and the opening of Urban Natures, the exhibition curated by Antoine Picon and organized by Dan Borelli and his team in the GSD's Druker Design Gallery. This exhibition originated at the Pavillon de l'Arsenal in Paris. Many of you will have no trouble reading the catalog, Natures Urbaines, because we know that many of you, entre vous, know French. Current GSD students come from 70 different countries and speak at least 56 different languages. We're so happy that our fears at the beginning of the summer did not pan out and you were all able to travel here smoothly. Thank you to our, it's the best news of all. Thank you to our student affairs and scenario planning teams who worked tirelessly through the summer to come up with alternative possibilities should this best outcome not have happened. We surveyed our 1,000 students over the summer and found out that 34 of the 56 languages they speak are their first or preferred languages, including French, Korean, Malay, Mandarin, and Turkish, among others. Our public programs poster this year will be a newspaper, each of its 34 pages listing events in each of these 34 languages, underscoring the GSD's absolute commitment to our international students, faculty, and staff, as well as our recognition that design has no borders. Of course, you can always go to the World Wide Web to find out what's going on. Please do, and please admire our fabulous new GSD website, which just launched 2 weeks ago after years of work. And if you're a current member of the GSD community, every Monday morning, you'll automatically receive weekly notices from our internal website, GSD Now, listing important events and deadlines for the coming week. Both the GSD website and GSD Now have tons of information and resources, so please take the time to look through them. I want to take a moment to welcome our 2 new full-time faculty members to the GSD, Professor Nestor Davidson, who's in the front row, and Associate Professor Avis Devine, who I think is still teaching, both of whom are in our Urban Planning and Design Department, and both will be teaching in our Master of Real Estate program. So let me introduce him a little bit. So we stole Nestor from Fordham's Law School. His focus is legality in the design environment and urban law. His works in progress include Cities in Law, which I think is a really funny title, with Cambridge University Press. In addition to teaching at Fordham for the past 14 years, Nestor worked in both the public and private sectors, notably serving as special counsel and deputy general counsel at HUD and chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. So you talk to him if you want to talk about rent. And as a lawyer at Latham & Watkins. Avis Devine comes to the GSD from York University, where she spent the past 12 years as an associate professor of real estate finance and sustainability. Her practice experience includes working in commercial real estate finance, underwriting, and valuation. To give you a sense of Avis's research, I'll mention just a couple topics. Power generation, which identifies which types of organizations, governments, private equity, listed firms, etc., own which types of energy, which generates infrastructure assets globally, so as to highlight which ones are holding dirty versus clean energy producing assets, and further, which are actively engaging with those assets to ramp up clean energy generation and wind down generation from fossil fuels. So it's a complicated set of parameters of looking at who's involved with what and who's doing good for the world. Additionally, she researches how diverse perspectives, for example, those people on corporate boards, can influence risk management in the real estate industry. So she's covering a lot of ground. Additionally, let me introduce this year's class of Loeb Fellows from top left, and they are in the second row, and they will stand up when their names are called. When their names are called. From top left, Andy Summers, Cecilia Cuff, Daniela Chacon-Arias, Jacek Smoliki, Natalia Rudiak, Julia Thane, Oliver Wainwright, Jeremiah Ellison, Jennifer Hughes, and Pedro Evora Amaral. Welcome here. You can learn more about them and from all of them on the Loeb Fellowship page of the website, that new website, remember that, and at the Meet the Loeb's Fellows panel discussion on Wednesday, the 17th of September. We have a lot of panel discussions here at the GSD. They're really a continuation of what happens in all of our classes. We learn from others, and while here, we learn how to formulate our opinions, our research, and our work so that others can learn from us. While it can sometimes feel like Gund is an international airport hub, the number of people and perspectives that pass through the GSD to teach, lecture, and sit on reviews is a major factor in what makes this school just so remarkable. This semester alone, we're welcoming, among others, Mariam Chabani from Paris, Yichun Liu from Shanghai, James Lord and Roderick Wiley from San Francisco, and Christian Benimana, Regina Chen, and Patricia Gruitz from Mass Design, based here in Boston, as well as Kigali, Rwanda. Visitors, I urge you to take the time to be here. Don't just fly through. And to our students and faculty here on our home team, you too need to be thoughtful about taking time. Take advantage of the range of voices, of opinions, of work we have here. Go to talks, discussions, and reviews outside your given program. Take time to look carefully at the exhibitions throughout the school, including in Loeb Library, which currently features the reflexive formalism of Associate Professor of Architecture John Lott's practice, the Experiments Wall by the elevator, where you can see Rose Monticello's projective history of landscape architecture pedagogies, and the Dean's Wall, which features recent graduate Connor Gravel's MArch thesis, which envisions a rehabilitative future for Gary, Indiana's steel industry. Everyone at the school should commit to getting a cup of coffee or a lunch or just chatting in the hallways with at least one person beyond your own little circle. There's always Chow House. Harvard University Press has just reissued some of Harvard's Norton lectures, including the artist Ben Shah's lectures that took place here at Harvard during the 1956-57 academic year. These are being published those were published in a small collection called The Shape of Content. In one of those talks, called The Education of an Artist, Ben Shah urges students to, quote, listen well to all conversations and be instructed by them and take all seriousness seriously. Never look down on anything or anyone as not worthy of notice. Do not be afraid to like paintings honestly or dislike them honestly. But if you do dislike them, retain an open mind. This is hugely important advice. Learning to engage in conversation does not mean striving to be the loudest, longest voice in the room. Slow down. Listen carefully. Listen to the points others are making and evolve what you are trying to say in exchange, rather than seeing a discussion, a review, or a conversation only as an opportunity to deliver a prepared point. Another of Shah's Norton lectures, entitled On Nonconformity, pushes further at this advice to develop and grow your own point of view, resisting the conformity of peer groups, tradition, and archetypes. Although he also warns against what he calls copybook nonconformity, that is, a kind of nonconformity that is itself predictable and established, even if hidden under a veneer of avant-gardism. New York's Jewish Museum has on view right now a retrospective of Sean's art entitled On Nonconformity, which originated at Madrid's Reina Sofia Museum. I encourage anyone here to visit this timely exhibition if you can. It surveys Sean's entire career, his paintings, his posters, his drawings, almost all of which address profound injustices ranging from discrimination to threats of freedom of expression in post-war America. In 1952, Sean wrote words that tragically still resonate today. He wrote, and you can see it up there, "If either art or society is to survive in the coming half-century, it'll be necessary for us to reassess our values. The time is past due for us to decide if we are a moral people or merely a comfortable people. It's not the survival of art alone that's at issue, but the survival of the free individual in a civilized society." Ben Shahn understood education, conversation, and the arts all as a means of confirming, not conforming values. If you are here, you already share a belief in the value of the design environment. If you are here, you want to advance your opinions, your research, your work. If you are here, you are part of a community of roughly 1,000 students, 250 faculty, and 175 staff, and 40 researchers. You can and you will learn from every one of them. Remember Sean's adage, "Never look down upon anything or anyone as not worthy of notice." Respect those around you, and you may well find yourself shifting directions thanks to a conversation or even a passing comment. You are not here to be comfortable. The HVAC system in Piper helps to ensure that fact. But you are here to be a moral people and to help all of us advance our modern world. Tonight's event is especially exciting to me because it showcases our own faculty. Both the panel discussion and the exhibition outside feature many GSD researchers and practitioners. Urban natures is a topic that embraces technology, politics, ecology, economics, and more, stretching across every one of our departments and programs here at the GSD. Tonight's event is supported by the Rachel Dorothy Tanur Memorial Lecture Fund, and after tonight's panel, please come together to raise a glass. Thank you to Ron Druker, member of the Loeb Fellowship Class of 1976, for so generously underwriting this all-school reception. Loeb Fellows, in 50 years, we expect you to do the same. Thank you, too, to the entire communications, exhibitions, and events team here at the GSD, as well as my dean's office staff for organizing the exhibition, this event, and the reception afterwards. And now it's my pleasure, finally, to welcome to the podium Antoine Picon, G. Ware Travelsteed, Professor of the History of Art, Architecture, and Technology. Merci, Antoine, for launching us into this new year.
Thank you, Sarah, for these very generous words. I would like to begin this short presentation by expressing my gratitude. An initial version of this exhibition was presented last year at the Pavillon de l'Arsenal in Paris. As Sarah reminded us, I'd like to thank the Pavillon team for making that possible. The research that led to the Paris exhibition and the book that went with it was supported by a grant from the Center for Green Buildings and Cities at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and thank you to its director, Professor Ali Malkawi. I would like also to acknowledge the contribution of my research assistant, Melanie Lutherbach, Eshna Prasad, and Ben Parker. The GSD exhibition was supported by Villa Albertine, the French Institute of Culture and Education. Thank you to its representative in Boston, Florence Botello. At the GSD, I would like to thank Dean Sarah Whiting for supporting this project from the start, as well as our Associate Dean of Communication and Public Programs, Ken Stewart, and his team. Thank you to Sarah Raffson, always look a little bit outlandish with a microphone, for helping organizing tonight's event. Thank you to Professor Erika Naginski, to whom I owe not to make officially many English mistakes. She reread patiently the text of the exhibition. And finally, I would like to express my special gratitude to Dan Borelli and his team. Working with Dan, David Zimmerman-Stewart, and Dana Boral, among others, has been a pleasure. Thanks to their decisive input, the GSD version of Urban Nature offers new perspective and a series of questions. So now, a few words on the overall ambition. They told me the screen would go black, and it went black, so everything is in order in paper. So a few words on the overall ambition of Urban Nature, a technological and political history, 1600 to 2030. So its starting point is evidently the growing importance of nature in urban discourse and practice. Public park, urban forest, and ecological corridors have become integral to urban planning and urban life. Due to the role of the Anthropocene in the rise of nature-related concerns, this phenomenon is often viewed as recent. So this exhibition invites us to consider an alternative perspective. It seeks to resist presentism, namely the illusion that all concerns belong uniquely to the present. In truth, the question of accessible public nature in the city has been around for centuries, at last since the 17th century, and we owe far more to this long and complex history than what we usually realize. The scope of the subject is enormous, because there have never been a single unified conception of nature in the cities. Instead, we find a variety of conceptions, not a diversity, we all know that, each expressing a different relationship between urban life and the natural world. Due to this variety or diversity, the title of the exhibition uses nature in the plural and highlights one history among the many stories that could be told. This history begins in the West, the region I know best, for I was unable to discuss every region in the world, but it then becomes more global while remaining focused on a number of dimensions or themes. So the first dimension has to do with imagination and design. What kind of city do we want? How do we envision it? How to realize it? In other words, the presence of nature in the city is inseparable from projects. And this exhibition can be read as a series of projects on cities both real and imagined. It proposes a reflection on the agency of design. Urban nature is one of the domains in which this agency is relatively evident, even if it raises all sorts of complex questions. Technology represents another dimension or theme. One needs technology to allow for natural elements to be present in the city, hence the recurring relationship between engineering and gardening, or the contemporary connection between nature and infrastructure. Here we could believe that we are in the wild. The scene is actually on top of a major freeway of the Parisian region. I find the emphasis on technology important at a time when there is a tendency to oppose nature and technology. For me, answering the challenge of the Anthropocene means finding ways to articulate in a productive way these two realities. Ideally, cities of the future should be both green and smart. Finally, there is the social and political dimension mentioned in the title of the exhibition. Since the 18th century at least, the presence of nature in cities has been inseparable from questions such as how do we want to live together? Here, the Retiro Park in 18th century Madrid. This theme is present throughout the exhibition. It explains why the final section, entitled Towards a New Social Contract, discusses how contemporary projects dealing with urban nature are inseparable from the ambition to promote a more inclusive and just society. So to develop these questions, The exhibition is organized chronologically. It begins with an evocation of pre-industrial cities. In these cities, nature was largely private for a long time. One found trees and gardens most of the time behind walls. In the second half of the 17th century, this began, however, to change with the creation of avenues and boulevards lined with trees on the outskirts of dense urban space. And here we have the Cours la Reine in the west of Paris, one of those early planted spaces. The idea also began to emerge that large gardens and parks could serve as models to rethink the city. Versailles in France, or Karlsruhe, the early 18th century new capital of one of the German states of the time, were illustration of that evolution. The Enlightenment represents a key turning point. Two ideas emerged at that time. First, urban nature is good for physical health of citizens. Second, the contact with nature pacifies the mind, thus contributing to improve social relation. This is the beginning of green is good. We are still marked by these two beliefs. Very rare to find somebody who hates nature in cities. And in a country like England, the new importance given to public urban nature led to innovative urban forms such as the London squares. More generally, nature appeared at the time as a source of inspiration to improve cities and territories. And it seemed to lead the path toward a possible reconciliation between the order dear to architects and urban planners and the spontaneity that characterized areas such as economic life. In the industrial age, the rising environmental and social problems that plagued cities gave to the presence of nature a new urgency. It led to the first large-scale systematic greening enterprises, such as the Promenade of Haussmann in Paris or Central Park in New York. These large-scale endeavors were characterized by a strong technological dimension. Here, a partial plan of Central Park drainage system. In the case of Paris, the system of planted avenues, square, and parks was conceived as a technological network, which was an integral part of the urban infrastructure. Sewers, lampposts, but also trees were supposed to be part of this infrastructure. Toward the end of the 19th century, a jump occurred with the first projects attempting to rethink the relationship between cities and nature on a regional scale. With modernism at its step toward the garden city ideal, a new theme appeared, that of a necessary reconciliation between highly mechanized society and nature. Despite the accusation often leveled against modernism that it had ignored nature, many contrary attitudes have their root in its experiments and concerns. For Le Corbusier and his colleagues, the modern city was to be a city in a garden or a park, an ideal that can still be felt in places like Brasilia or Chandigarh. The next section is dedicated to the period extending roughly from the immediate post-war year to the early 21st century, a transition between past and present. This is a complex period. It saw the rise of contemporary environmental concerns. For the first time, nature was seen as globally endangered, and at the same time, turning to nature appeared as one of the only ways to heal the wounds left by industry. Large remediation projects, such as Emscher Park in the German Ruhr region, are emblematic of this mobilization of nature. The results are often complex and ambiguous. They appear as hybrids of nature and technology. Projects such as the restoration of the Cheongye-cheon stream. Korean is not my strong point, despite my love for Korean TV shows. So in Seoul, South Korea, or Fresh Kills on Staten Island, a park realized upon what used to be one of the world's largest urban dumps, epitomized this hybridity. From such projects, the section moved to the birth of landscape urbanism in the United States, but also in other countries where from the 1980s onwards, landscape architects began to appear as major player in the field of urban planning and urban design. The two final sections of the exhibition leave history to examine the present and the trends it reveals. The first of these two sections discusses some key features of the country green city, such as the new importance given to the soil. The cross-section appears more and more as a determining feature of many urban nature projects. The relationship to water is also changing through approaches like the sponge city that address the increased flooding risk linked to climate change. Regarding vegetation, one now seeks a new balance between planned and unplanned nature, a balance complex to achieve because of the problems caused by invasive species. Following this examination of the way in which the fundamental elements of urban nature are thought in different ways today, this section moves to country parks, urban forests, ecological corridors, urban farms, and green buildings. Beyond the ever-expanding catalogues of figures of the country green city, the exhibition explores how nature and technology are more and more systematically hybridized, how one of the challenges may be sometimes to abandon traditional compositional techniques approaches in favor of the identification of strategic natural resources that can be linked to each other in different ways, and adopting treatments that highlights biodiversity, as well as the ability of plant and animal species to circulate with greater freedom. So whereas the exhibition had started with Europe and North America, the game has become more global with examples from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The last section of the exhibition is about the relationship between the country presence of nature in cities and the possibility to rethink the way we live together. If we follow authors such as the late Bruno Latour, we need to rebuild social ties by including non-humans in political deliberation. Experiments are taking place around the world to test the feasibility of what Latour and many environmentalists after him refer to as Parliament of Things. Taking most of the time a step back from this type of ambition, designers are attempting to propose projects that use natural elements to strengthen ties between communities and seek to promote greater social justice. These projects can be urban farms, like here in Chicago. They can be parks, like this one in Mexico. After this brief summary of some of the subjects and themes covered in the exhibition, I'd like to evoke a couple of ulterior motives. One of them is to question the complex relationship we have with modernity. Have we truly become postmodern, or must we accept that we're still hybrids, still very modern in some respects, while seeking to free ourselves from the most questionable aspects of modernity? Another underlying question concerns the future of technology. Those who know me know that I'm kind of technology obsessed. How should we think about its inevitable hybridization with living organisms? This is a question for engineers as well as for architects. This reflection is inseparable from a series of concerns regarding the role of history. It takes a longue durée view, and above all, follows a path that leads from the past to the present and tries not to reduce today to a mere consequence of yesterday, but rather to reveal its full potential for change. So whether we like it or not, we are on the eve of profound changes. These changes evidently affect designers. As I say, this exhibition largely revolves around the question of the agency of design. What can design achieve in the age of the Anthropocene? This interrogation concerns actually history as well. For it is almost impossible today to write history without taking into account the country crisis. In such a context, I'm reminded of a quote by the French historian Marc Bloch that has haunted me for years. At the time of the Great Depression, in the early 1930s, Bloch was invited by a club of engineers and managers to give a lecture on the contribution of history to the understanding of crisis. In his lecture, published by the Journal of the Club, Marc Bloch declared at some point that the role of history is to convey to its reader, I quote, the imperative sense of change. As I said, this quote, which I discovered early on in my research journey, has haunted me ever since. I must have used it at least a dozen times. To write history as an historian, but also to inspire those who listen to you or read your work to embrace inevitable change, to make this change desirable rather than threatening. This is what I've tried to do as an historian in the design school, and it is the ultimate ambition of this exhibition, to show how urban nature may lead us to different and hopefully better cities. Thank you. So now, following this short presentation, I tried to remain short, let me turn to our panelists who will discuss three key themes related to the exhibition before entering into a discussion moderated by Professor Erika Naginski. So coming from Europe, I won't have endless presentation, but I'll try to remain short. But first, we will listen to Professor Ali Malkawi, who is Professor of Architectural Technology, Director of the Doctor of Design program, and founding Director of the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities at Harvard GSD, who will address issues related to nature, technology, and climate mitigation. Next, Professor Gary Hilderbrand, Peter Louis Hornbeck, Professor in Practice of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Architecture at the GSD, has the daunting task to talk about the agency of designers. And finally, Mohsen Mostafavi, the Alexander and Victoria Wiley Professor of Design at Harvard and Harvard University Distinguished Professor, who served as Dean from 2008 to 2019, will discuss the relationship between urban nature and the social contract. And Professor Erika Naginski will serve as moderator. She's the Robert P. Hubbard Professor of Architectural History at the GSD, and she right now hates me because I did mobilize her for this event. So please join me in welcoming the first of our four panelists to the podium, Professor Malkawi.
Thank you, Antoine, for the invitation. I'm going to be basically discussing a few concepts that are related to technology that Antoine also mentioned in his lecture. In Antoine's book, he raised the question, smart city or green city. He writes, rather than presenting these two models as antinomic, even though they are both essential dimensions of the city of the future, we need to consider their convergence. Well, my own expertise is related to buildings, not to cities. But today I would like to take a bit of risk based on your invitation and expand the discussion to the scale of cities. I want to reflect on this idea of convergence, and I want to question its relationship to nature, especially in the context of climate change, which is the challenge that basically was presented to me by Antoine. Because the way our cities interact with natural systems, air, water, energy, biodiversity, will determine not just whether we are smart or they are smart, but whether they are truly sustainable. We see this vividly today. We all know this. Cities overheating during record heat waves because they lack shade or tree cover. Flooding intensified by hard, impermeable surfaces. Biodiversity disappearing as urban growth severs ecological corridors. These are failures not of technology itself, but of our inability to integrate technology and nature together in design. Nature threatened and nature repairing. This is what Antoine basically wrote in his book. These two are essential concepts, are two faces of our challenge. And as Antoine's book reminds us, this duality is central to the future of cities. When excluded, nature becomes fragile and degraded. But when meaningfully integrated, nature becomes a force of repair, helping cities adapt, heal, and sustain life. Now, technology is advancing at extraordinary speed. We all know this. Our buildings and cities are smarter than ever, equipped with sensors, automation, and real-time data systems and feedback. And yet, despite these remarkable strides, our built environment has not kept pace with the realities of climate change. That disconnect, similar to what Antoine spoke to us a few minutes ago, has deep roots. The Enlightenment encouraged us to see nature as something to be mastered through reason and technology. That gave us the tools of science and innovation, but it also set a pattern of overconfidence that still lingers in how we build our buildings and cities today. The building sector, for example, still accounts for nearly 40% of global carbon emissions, and a lot of examples were also given in Antoine's book about those statistics. Many new projects still rely on outdated, carbon-intensive systems and design approaches that ignore ecological limits. The problem isn't that we lack technology. The problem is, in my view, twofold. We haven't prioritized sustainability in how we use technology, and also many of the technologies we rely on were never developed with sustainability as their purpose in their first place. So, two parts, or two concepts. One that are related to application, which is an application gap, and the other one is a design gap. The application gap, we see often technology used for profit, speed, or convenience instead of ecology. The design gap, many of the technologies also we see themselves, or they see themselves, that are originally built for other priorities and climate or sustainability. So let me outline very briefly few of these reasons, or few of the reasons for this disconnect. Reasons that affect both buildings and cities. And I'm going to be discussing very briefly 5, although there are exceptions to many of these points that I'm going to be raising. One of the first points I wanted to make is market and economic pressures. Profit and speed still outweigh ecology, the developers chasing return, and for cities chasing growth. Regulatory gaps, green certificates help, definitely, but aren't universal or enforced. City codes often lag behind climate science. Cultural and institutional inertia. We keep building with 20th century habits, car grids, sprawl, rigid zoning, and unsustainable design. Over-reliance on tech fixes. This is really an important point. I see, in my view, there is a growing tendency to treat sustainability as a technological problem and technology itself can solve, or can be solved by, and sustainability can be solved by gadgets and upgrades. Solar panels, sensors, advanced HVAC systems cannot compensate for poor design and orientation and so on and so forth. Apps and dashboards don't solve fossil transport or inequity. Finally, and there are many of these reasons, I wanted to mention something that is dear to me, which I also educate my students about, the challenge of translation. It's hard to turn climate principles and goals into design. We see it in design schools. And even harder to scale them across entire cities. This gap is why so many cities declare climate emergencies, but struggle to implement real change. Now, this brings me back to the topic that we're basically here discussing nature and cities. True sustainability is not only technical, it's ecological. Technology can measure, monitor, and optimize, but only by integrating natural systems into design, we can create buildings and cities that are resilient and regenerative. And sustainability is not only ecological, it must also respond to human nature. Green in buildings is more than decorative. Plants, daylight, and natural ventilation reduce stress, improve health, and enhance productivity. Green in cities is more than symbolic. Parks and corridors provide public space, support equity, and foster community. Nature, when integrated meaningfully, sustains both the environment and humanity. So, if smart cities are to be sustainable, their technological nature must converge with their ecological nature, and both definitely must connect with the human nature. That convergence is our opportunity. We are at schools of design, and this is a challenge for all of us. To design cities that are not only intelligent, but regenerative, responsive to climate change, supportive of biodiversity, and deeply connected to natural and human systems that sustain life. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Antoine, thank you for the invitation and for really a fantastic exhibition. My assignment, so-called by you challenging, is to discuss the agency of the designer. I like this prompt. I see a lot of human agency out there, especially in the first half of the exhibition, right? Lots of projects for rulers, nobles, lots of agency. From Bruno Latour and others, we understand agency as the power to act. Latour, though, wants us to dehumanize agency and conscript it to nature. So I'm here to tell you, and I think many of you know this, that we live in a time when scholars and philosophers in the social and physical sciences are telling us that nature has greater agency than designers do. And with the climate crisis, I'm tempted to agree, with a caveat. Yes, nature has agency, but so do mere mortals, even those who don't work for royals. And more on this later. If the ecologist and philosopher David Abrams' phrase from the 1990s, the more than human world, was perhaps the jumpstart on a path to the agency of non-humans, it was the historian Donna Haraway, her work, around the same time that brought weight and thrust to rigorous condemnations of the Anthropocene. And if Latour is the favorite of the architects, he spoke at this stage about a decade ago, I would say Anna Singh's work resonates most with our landscape architecture students. Her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in the capitalist ruin, captivates on so many levels, connecting anthropology, ecology, agriculture, microeconomics, through a reading of the agency and commodity of the Matsutake mushroom in supply chains in Japan, Finland, and the Pacific Northwest. For me, some scholars in this more than human sphere travel too far. So for instance, Peter Vollenben's very popular book, The Hidden Life of Trees, I'll bet half of the people in this room have read it, goes too far, especially when he gets to mother trees and personification. He speaks of trees having feelings. I'll admit that I dropped about 100 pages in, just couldn't do it. Trees are not sentient beings. But the so-called natural intelligence they demonstrate through the interconnectedness of their root and fungal networks, their so-called communication systems, and their capacity to work together to survive potential catastrophic stresses, those are believable. A certain power to act, agency. So with that as a frame, let me turn to this image. I want to thank my dear colleague Alex Wall for reminding me of it. The image here of Karlsruhe, where Alex began his important thinking about the city, epitomizes the Enlightenment imagining of an idealized urban condition. The city is figured, objectified, centered, geometricized, compartmentalized. Nature is mostly contained, or it's othered, as in the forest, with an order that seems maybe God-given, or at least in deference to the monarch who is striving for perfection. I'll admit that I've always been drawn to this and other absolutist forms of city-making. They're appealing. And the consequent taming of nature as a medium of expression. But there's a lot to be critical of. Here I come to my main point. The Pakistani novelist Amitav Ghosh, in his 2016 book, listen to this title, if you don't know it, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Amazing book. He sees this kind of break between human agency and nature as catastrophic. And he says this about how the Earth and its climatic forces are pushing back on our anthropogenic ways. Quote, "Can the timing of Latour's actor network theory and the new animism, which actually comes from Abram, be mere coincidence? Or is the synchronicity an indication that there are entities in the world, like forests, that are fully capable of inserting themselves into our processes of thought? And if that were so, could it not also be said that the Earth itself has intervened to revise those habits of thought that are based on the Cartesian dualism that arrogates all intelligence and agency to the human while denying them to every other kind of being?" Later, he says, very succinctly, climate change challenges and refutes Enlightenment ideas. That's very powerful. We meet again, Ali. Can we think of the city as a regrowth forest, occupied mutually by humans and the more than human? If so, as the urban foresters have shown us, we have to work in certain ways. The image from Agence Terre here describes exactly how the agency of humans and the agency of nature must coexist in the city. As opposed to othered and compartmentalized, the Barcelona project by Henri Bava and his team is described cross-sectionally as permeable, porous, networked, systemic, infrastructural, and interdependent. Do we even have a choice to think of the city in terms other than this today? We call this the deep section in our department, and it invokes all kinds of things that you can only think about in section. Finally, while I'm agreeing that nature has propulsive agency, I want to further press the case for the continued agency of designers in coexistence with that of nature. And my professional experience allows me to insist that we have it. With my Reed Hilderbrand partner, Eric Kramer, along with my colleagues Stephanie Shah and Matt Soul, we led a 3-year project for our city, Cambridge, aimed at finding ways to stem the startling decline of the urban canopy and to devise ways that expand shade in the name of climate resiliency. It was a data-driven project with extensive community participation. Lots of urban forestry advocates in Cambridge. We have just been commissioned to execute a 5-year update on that framework. I believe we had agency in this project because we directly affected city policy, governance, and practices. We helped the City Council to rewrite its tree protection ordinance to provide for more stringent controls on tree removal and mitigation from both private and public property. They hired a forester. They went from planting 600 trees a year to 1,200. They built a tree nursery, and they're now growing their own trees, along with a composting facility that allows them to add liquid biological amendments to their plantings to accelerate the all-important nutrient cycling that will let trees grow, develop, and mature. They created a watering brigade, and they bought 4 electric bikes equipped to water all the trees all day long. And they built a soils management regime that is producing a more permeable, ecologically healthy soil network in the city. They also enlisted the largest landowners in the city, Harvard and MIT, in this drive for the expansion of the tree canopy. If agency is the creative capacity to act towards meaningful change in institutions or in society, we've done it here. Nature has a chance to thrive again. And I think this example comports with the idea of distributed agency, as discussed in literature and social sciences more generally. It reflects shared agency by the designers, the city officials, and varied stakeholders who seek aligned and positive outcomes, and to see the city as alive and networked and interdependent. The city is a forest. Finally, I'm just thrilled to have this amazing panorama in the gallery. It's called Urban Natures. Nature, yes. Cities, yes. Thank you, Antoine, for brightening the start of the school year with something of a world history of landscape architecture.
Good afternoon. Antoine, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Thank you for the exhibition. I mentioned to Antoine this morning when we bumped into each other on the second floor that, he knows that I saw the exhibition at the Arsenal, and it really does look better here. It's more condensed, it's tighter, and I think it then gives a really kind of very good impression of the material. And I think it's also such a nice thing, as it's been said, and Sarah mentioned it as well, to have this, and Gary has just spoken about this, to have this kind of thing at the beginning of the year, because it's very inspiring, it's very informative, there's a lot of material which we can all learn from. At the same time, I'm kind of sad because institutions have a very short memory. So this exhibition won't be there next year. And you need things like this every year in some ways to remind us of some of the kind of main issues or themes that we have to think about and we have to consider. I also want to thank Erika in advance for leading us and guiding the discussion. So when I was asked to talk briefly, and I've already talked for a minute, to talk briefly about this topic of nature in cities and the social contract. Of course, the first thing was, it's Antoine. Because the word social contract, I mean, here we are in Cambridge, Massachusetts. What is the social contract? Whose social contract is this? And so it's very clear that, of course, this is a French theme in many ways, and we have to go with that. We have to go with this concept of the French social contract. Of course, this term also was very important and relevant in England as well, but it's really the French version that we are dealing with. But there can be other versions of this. So, on the panel outside, there is Antoine's text, and in this, he is referring to, of course, the question of the concept of the social contract from Rousseau of 1762. And I think it's important to know that this concept is a very specific thing about the relationship between people and the state, people and the government. And it implies the fact that I am going to give up part of my freedom in order for the state to take care of things. And therefore, I have to give up something in order to be governed, in order to be ruled. But in exchange for that, I'm also going to get something, because I'm expecting the state to look after me. This is a reciprocal relationship between the state and the people, which I think is very important. And so, for example, in relation to this topic, it said things like the legitimate political authority arises from the collective consent of citizens who form a sovereign body to enact laws reflecting the general will for the common good. So it's people who are creating the general will for the common good. So what is that now? What is it today? What is our relationship to the state? What is the state's relationship to us? On the right-hand side, I put a frontispiece from Rousseau's The Social Contract. And the subtitle invariably doesn't happen, is not mentioned in the English translations. But anyway, underneath that, you'll see that it says that Rousseau was also a citoyen de Genève. He was a citizen of Geneva. But the thing is, this word in French is not quite the same thing as the word citizen in English. And my French is not good like some other people, but I do know that this word implies a certain level of engagement. I, as the citizen, have a responsibility for engaging with society, and it's my engagement that also provides the possibility of the relationship between the state and me. So the role of the citizen is not a neutral role, it is a participatory role. I am a citizen because I act, because I participate, in order to then benefit from the social contract. So the social contract is a kind of dynamic thing. So I want to say, if there's one thing that is worthwhile for us, is that this has parallels with institutions. I also have, institutions also create forms of social contract with their constituency, with their citizens. And that also demands of the citizens, of all of us, to be engaged and to have certain level of relationship, of performance, and things like that, which comes from the role of the citizen. So this question of citizen and citizenship that is in Rousseau is inseparable from the idea of the social contract. There is no social contract without the role of participatory citizenship, in a way, and that exists also in institutions, including academic institutions. Now, the middle image, which I took from the exhibition, it's next door to the panel, which is showing one of these, prototypical type of allotments. Before, we would refer to such a thing as a productive urban landscape. Landscapes where you can participate with your neighbors and you are doing things with your hand. And these landscapes, these allotments, like in the UK, there's a lot of them, they are therapeutic, they are healing, they are mediating elements between the citizens because it brings them together, because they don't have to talk. The planting and working on there is the means of negotiation, of the means of constructing a relationship. And it's been important even for migrants to really find ways of mediating with, in fact, neighbors, people who would not be so kind of supportive of them. So I think this kind of landscape that Antoine has put there is a very important aspect of this. But again, the second thing I want to say is that, but is that enough? Is it enough to talk about how we are going to live together and the way in which we are going to construct our friendship, relationship, mediated by a kind of agricultural landscapes or whatever in the city, because I think that that's not enough. I think that these elements are key, they're critical, but at the same time, we should demand for more. We should demand for the involvement of the state, of government, of us, at the level of the territory, at the level of the city, at the level of the urban. It's not enough for this, just for us to go and work on some allotment together and be friends and be healed. So I think that's really the key question today. How do we construct certain forms of relationship that will enable this kind of bigger project? And this, in a way, Antoine has put a copy of Ecological Urbanism there, and I'm happy to tell you, Gary, that it's not 10 years ago, it's 16 years ago, that Bruno Latour and Peter Sloterdijk were here. And I think that's what I'm talking about. Institutions have short memories. Because then I think it's not just about nature, and that's why we use the kind of term ecology, because the ecological can have the possibility of incorporating this broader picture of relationships between the citizenry and the kind of project. I think the key thing is really how do we bring that to the institution, in the sense that we don't then just pass on that responsibility to the state, because in one sense now we are the state. We are the ones who are constructing that particular project. And so what kind of cities are we making? What kind of architecture are we making? All of that. So I think have I run out of time, or do I have a couple more? No? Okay, so I just want to move to, I'm so worried about not going over 9 minutes. So we're supposed to have 10 minutes. So those three you have seen. Then there's often these things when it comes to architecture. The one on the left, very, very good friend of mine, Stefano Boeri, who has become the sort of brand architect. This is, projects like the Bosco Verticale in Italy, in Milan, where architects have to also think about this question of nature in the city. It's not just urbanists, but it's architects. So what's the responsibility of the architect? And the architect, starting with people like Ken Yang, many, many years ago, starting to think about how this question of nature actually intervenes the building. And I think Stefano has managed to master that. And there are many versions of Stefano all over China now, where this idea is present. And then on the right, I'm showing you a very brand new kind of project finished last year by Thomas Heatherwick in Tokyo, done by the Mori Corporation. And here, there is nature in the architecture, but the nature is a kind of carpet thrown on the roof of the building, and it's an image. I mean, at least you can say with Stefano that there are balconies, and there is some relationship between inside and outside. But here, if you look at the buildings are utterly normal. It's like the green carpet, which is the visual, the image of nature in the city. So I think in order to think about the future, sometimes we have to go back, and sometimes we have to think forward. But if we go back like 55 years ago, not to Tokyo, but to Paris again, and go to Ivry, you will see that people at that time were thinking about the relationship between greenery and architecture in a different way, in a way that was formally, functionally about the maximization of greenery for the citizens of housing. It was a very pragmatic thing to do, but intellectually very difficult thing to resolve in terms of geometry, the role of the diagonal, the space of the green, and things like this. So I think this is something that is important. I have 52 seconds now, and I want to mention one other thing, and that's just going back to the question of the urban. So if we are to think about new ways of dealing with the city and nature, one of the things that, I started discussing, and I haven't really sort of thought about it much, is really this idea that we have to think about cities through the concept of agonism and through the idea of what I refer to as agonistic urbanism, which is another dimension, that in the city, this question of ecology has to really deal with the idea of conflict, and it has to deal with the idea of difference. It's not about finding some beautiful, picturesque landscape, but it's about the recognition of the conflictual conditions of the urban, and therefore agonism, or agonistic urbanism, is a precondition for the reconciliation of nature in the city and the way in which we might think about a new form of social contract that we're all going to engage in, talk together about, and participate in order to make better futures. Thank you.
And I think our mics are on, yes? All right. Well, you've all given us a great deal to think about, and I have to say, Mohsen, you're lovely to say that I'm a good guide, but I'm not. I feel rather overwhelmed. I'm glad that you mentioned going back, because that's what this exhibition does. I'm a historian here. I'm an early modernist, actually. But going back and thinking about 16 years ago, actually, when I first came to the GSD, I was there that night, and I remember Bruno Latour, and I remember Peter Sloterdijk, and as wonderful as they were, I can tell you that I cringed in my seat when Sloterdijk announced that women were apartment houses. Do you remember that? That because we could bear children, we were like apartment houses, and I went bananas on that one. But that said, let me just start out by saying a few things about the exhibit and then turning to our three talks, which actually were wonderfully connected in a way that I had not expected. It was a good sequence, but I really encourage you to go through that exhibit, which ambitiously does two things. First of all, it's a kind of diachrony, right? It's a selective one, that said, and a thematic highlighting. It is incredibly difficult to be synchronic and diachronic and to find that axis of representation. But if you think about the steps along the way, we have the pre-industrial city, perhaps what the Renaissance would have called the monsters in the garden. The Enlightenment, but with a good bit about the 17th century, and I have some thoughts, Gary, that we can discuss. I mean, I think the Enlightenment sits there as a powerful but very fraught entity. Then we have the machines in the garden, the industrial age, and modernism, and then the second half of the 20th century where suddenly nature is picking up steam as part of an ecological urbanism, and our present. And Antoine is particularly interested in the relationship to things like water and soil, but there are other aspects that we could talk about. But woven throughout this are these three themes that actually our speakers tonight sought to present. We have technology, and Ali made a very lovely case, and I know how Zero, we've talked about its relationship to the Enlightenment too, but made the case for thinking about the ways in which technology and sustainability are actually a kind of agon, to go back to your concept, and what we might do to think about the collision and coalescence of these things. But what was wonderful is the way that you ended with the question of, well, nature or human nature? How do we think these two things? Which was a beautiful segue to Gary, who then talked about agency. Human agency, nature's agency, and ultimately to some ideas about the fact that human agency is necessarily collective, which brings us to Mohsen, right? And this question of the social contract. One thing that I kept thinking about, and this is, we were dropping references right and left, Bruno Latour, whoever it might be. But I remember years ago reading a wonderful book by a scholar who actually taught in a literature department at Stanford, Robert Pogue Harrison, who wrote a wonderful book, I recommend it to everybody, simply entitled Forests. And what he did essentially, in a bit of a way that reminds me of Antoine's exhibit, whose texts I know too well, I think, what he did was he devoted a chapter to a particular moment in time. And he treated forests, let's say nature, capital N, and looked at the ways in which collectively nature was cast in different periods of time. So let's take the absolutist 17th century. Forests were a danger zone. Forests were feared. They were the haven of the underworld, of the other, of criminals, of the mad, right? Our own English colonial history has marshes or swamps that are also, the other. What's interesting, though, is by the time we get to the Enlightenment, there's a whole almost gendered discourse about care. You see it in the encyclopedia. No longer feared, but something to be tended to. So we begin to realize that nature sits in this very complicated way, and this is really about semiotics or narrative theory, even literary criticism. Is it a cultural construct? How do we understand it as a cultural construct as opposed to a thing unto itself? And this is something that is writ large in all of the images, representations, projects, and by the way, machines and tools. I want to just say, I want to call out the fact that there's a table out there, thank you, Dan, of actually apparatuses that we got from the Science Center. We've been trying to do that for over a decade, and there they are. I suggest you go look at them. They're wonderful. They are worlds unto themselves. But ultimately, I think what I want to get at, and this is perhaps my first question, is one, that relationship in each of your arguments between this question of nature as a, let's say, an intellectual construct, as opposed to a thing unto itself, and secondly, how this relates to the question of scale in each of your talks. There's the scale of the architect, there's the scale of the landscape architect, there's the scale of the urbanist, there's the scale of the technologist, and throughout here, I think that the question of scale and the ways those things might bring into relation some question of construction as opposed to a thing unto itself is operating in all of your talks. The other thing I would sit on, and maybe this makes me go back to the Renaissance, and it's something that Antoine and I never really talked about as he was setting it up, and it hit me when I was listening to Gary, is the relationship, at least in the early modern period in Europe, between, and this is true for Ali too, between techne and disegno. We forget when we use the word technology that there's a root there, techne. The solution, the craft that is applied, that we work with our hands. And disegno somehow attached to the imagination, to the plan, as into the vision, almost has a utopian projective quality. And I think, again, in each of your talks, these two things sit in a strange relationship. They're not entirely coherent, not because your talks weren't coherent, but because they aren't coherent when they sit side by side. That is something that the early modern period gave us. And lastly, I couldn't help it. These wonderful interlocutors are giving us these quotes, and thank you for bringing in Rousseau. Let's not forget that the social contract in the Rousseauist imaginary is fundamentally tied to nature. He was obsessed with nature, and one of the changes between the 17th century and absolutist rigidity and Cartesianism to an Enlightenment sense of nature, which became far more systemic, which recognized in nature itself a kind of hybridization and a systematicity, is fascinating. And I just want to end with this quote as a kind of prompt for the three of you. And it's in Rousseau's Confessions, not in his social contract. And he's talking about nature. And he says, this prodigious variety that reigns in its organization transports only those who have some faint idea of the ecological system. He uses végétal, but he really means ecological in this case. And he goes on to say, others, meaning the rest of us, are incapable of seeing this because we can't see the totality, meaning that we have no idea about the chain of relations and combinations that overpower these marvels that hit our spirit. And I think that wonderful quote tells us something about how we try to construct nature as a kind of narrative or construct or even technological construct when we mimic it, when we put carpet on buildings, right? When we simply represent it. Or rather try to seek out what those collisions and coalescences of systems, implications, and changes are. So let me start there and throw it back at you. And we will get to questions in the audience. Mohsen.
How much time do we have to prepare for
As
this
much as
answer?
I-
No, I think we now need time to go and prepare.
Go for it. Go for it. I couldn't prepare either, my dear.
Well, I think that maybe one small point, which I think would be interesting, related to your question about scale and things. Part of this history, which I see so beautifully laid out, and at some point when I was a student, I actually spent quite a bit of time looking at this earlier period in Italy, and on sort of like counter-Reformation urban history, where one particular cardinal built a garden and then used his garden in order to transform Rome. And so the Rome that we see is basically the Rome of this Cardinal Montalto, which he became Sixtus V. And so the idea, it's very similar to the boulevards of Paris, but it's really the idea of the streets of pilgrimage going from one church to the other. But the thing that I was sort of thinking about is that many of these examples of nature and the city are to do with the question of replication of the image of the Bosco, the image of the forest, the image of Versailles, and through it, the image of the seat of power of the king, and therefore the play between the seat of power of the king and the city. And I think that when you're asking about the question of scale, and this is why the discussion of ecology, on one level, it's not about the image. It's really about a broader environmental question. So you could say, scale-wise, is that like a planetary thing? Because you're really dealing with not what it looks like and we're going to copy it, but that it's about a certain set of relations, environmental, social, political, and subjective, and therefore that becomes the ground in relation to which then we are thinking about the design of cities or the design of buildings, and that sort of sequence I think is relevant to, in a way, resist the imagistic relationship. So that's sort of one point, and then one second point related to what you were saying. What I find interesting is that, and I wasn't so aware of this, like ecological urbanism, things like that, is, when you think about a landscape architect like Gilles Clément, in France, this is a landscape architect who is sort of doing a version of Bava and Agence Terre. But his concept of the garden in movement is allowing a form of rewilding where the garden is sort of thinking, it's like the design with nature, but it's I think that he is onto something. In a way, Gilles Clément is onto something quite interesting. So part of this question of the interrelationship of things, I wonder how it also is connected to this question of wildness, of some form of of the resistance of the order of the rational project, which is, the kind of human subject. So I think the ecological versus the sort of garden in movement combination seems like an interesting set of parameters
And you had
to
already
bring together.
put your finger on it in ecological urbanism. You were already pushing these ways of thinking forward. But it makes me think of Gary. Maybe we can turn to you here, because I think there are images and there are images. There are ways to search things out. And you said some very provocative things about the section.
Thank you. I just want to make a point about what you said, Mohsen, about Agence Terre and Gilles Clément. Agence Terre follows Clément, and they are pushing it further, but we have to grant him the origin of that Jardin Mouvement. I want to address a particular point that you raised, and it's maybe a simplistic one, but the question of whether nature is a human construct. It's both.
It's both.
It's both. Nature exists, right? It tends toward entropy, and that's part of our little part in the exhibition. It tends toward entropy, and it's never ordered in the way that we would make it ordered. Anita Berespetia last year talked about the way that Charles Eliot took a reservation in the Blue Hills from being a fully degraded coppiced forest, mainly a production site for firewood, and built a forest that resembles nature. And this is, a shining example in my mind of the fact that we do need constructs. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? I mean, we have to have discourse, right? We have dialectic. We need that frame. It's Greek mathematics. I mean, we need it to make sense of the sky. And so always it's going to be a human construct that produces anything that we've touched, a human construct. And this is fascinating to me because I surely get to work in places where nature has kind of gone its course. And we work to bring it back to something that maybe resembles the image that we've learned from, the images in history. We've learned from representation. We've learned from real places. But that is where, as I argued in the piece, natural intelligence and human agency have to be together, have to work together.
Ali, then, when you end with a kind of call for technology to attend to sustainability in a serious way, how would you see that extend from something like House Zero to the city? Beyond, House Zero is, in some sense, a machine in a garden, right? It's constantly calibrating, measuring, seeing how we inhabit, what light we need, what warmth we need, how much energy is being used, with such precision. And you yourself say, yes, there's the smart city. There's also a concept called the green city. How do we then extrapolate? How do we move outwards? How do we autonomize?
Sure, thank you. First of all, thanks for the wonderful synthesis about three distinct subjects where technology comes into play in many different ways. We spoke about history, and Antoine's book talks a lot about the history of nature in the city. and its roots, and I just briefly discussed the idea of its roots in relation to its enlightenment from a conceptual perspective and how it basically influenced the way that we think in a rational way, as well as the way about which we think about the environment in general now and its connection to the issue of climate change. I think moving forward, it seems to me there are a couple things I wanted to discuss in relation to technology from the point of view of what you've alluded to, which is discussions that are related to House Zero, but from the point of view of the concept of it, right? It's really a different way of using technology from the point of view rather than seeing technology as an enabler of nature from historically. To trying to figure out how to use technology to connect us with nature, right? And that has a lot of different implications, right? Now we see that from the point of view of technology rather than as you mentioned yourself, the machines, right? Into the idea of data and software in the age of AI, right? Where software becomes the softer part of how we can connect with nature, right? And data is the enabler for us to be able to interact with it. The intention has been now, and still it seems to me is going to be how we're going to be able to sense the environment for us to be able to connect better with that environment. So the human aspects become an important aspects of it, right, from the point of view of interaction, but technology, in a sense, it's going to be really that interface between the in and the out. The in and out with the concepts that we know very much that is, and the ideas that we think they are vital now, issues of pollution, how we're going to be able to connect with nature, knowing pollution is out there, right? So if you're going to have, just for the sake of example, if you're going to have natural ventilation, right, which we know that is so essential for many different aspects of us being connected with the outside, but pollution is out there. How are you going to basically be able to interact with those? So sensing becomes important, modeling becomes important. So it's a different way of thinking about technology, right? From the point of view of these heavy machines, even the way that we're thinking about HVAC systems, in a radical way, to ways of thinking about software, right? That will enable us to be able to connect with the environment in a completely different way. So we might see, right, ways of connecting with or utilizing technology that's completely different than what we've seen in history, right? And perhaps our designs of buildings and our designs of cities are going to be different if we're embracing those types of ideas. At the same time, making sure that we're taking into consideration these environmental concepts as well as the challenges that we face today with climate change.
I mean, this does, in some ways, this is a gentle gauntlet on the table. I very much appreciate the attempt at a longue durée. I think there is a kind of exhausting presence of the present. And I want to turn to each of you and ask you how you see the benefits of that historical purview. Because it isn't merely representation. I mean, I also think that whatever images or machines or texts are on the wall, they are all, maybe to use your word, Ali, attempts at sensing beyond or outside the construct of nature itself, right? It's the nature itself. And I just wonder for each of you, what is the status of that historical view in the exhibit, and what does it do for your sort of sense of your own projects? Because it is, I do want to emphasize this. Antoine was right. We don't often get this kind of overview. We simply don't.
If you don't mind, I think it grounds us, right, of knowing where we came from, right? Technology, for example, in a way, the way that you present it in the book as well as in the exhibit, it allows us to know where we were and where we're going to be going. But the principles that were outlined are basically similar, right? They're going to be always similar in terms of how we're going to be basically going from where we are to or where we're in terms of past as well as present as well as the future. So it reminds us of the essential principles that has been taken into account for many years, but at the same time things have changed, right? And those changes we need to take into consideration very much vividly for us to be able to move to the second stage. And again, from a technological perspective, theoretically, it's similar ideas that are going to be basically transcending into the future, but the way that we're going to be using it is going to be most likely different.
Mohsen said it very well before, how important it is for us to have events like this and displays like this, and our memory is short. For me, the frames of the exhibition, the segments of it, are extremely useful, and they all count in our way of engaging with history. The images, I think, when I was a graduate student, it felt extremely urgent for me to go and see all of those landscapes. And I think our students go elsewhere now. And so, I'm happy with all of this imagery on the wall because it reminds. It reminds. And that's only one use of history, but a really vital one for the community.
So I think what's inspiring is the fact that we see many projects, and that projects are, you've said it, Antoine has said it, is part of a plan and part of a decision-making process. And because we're within the context of the academy where we are also making projects, we have this benefit of seeing basically how this happened in the past. And I think this is basically, I think it's open to interpretation. What happened in the past, how it might be in the future, what is the relationship between how they did it, how we might do it. I think this is probably a really kind of key part of that. I think it's also important to build a little bit on what Ali was saying about the connection to technology, but I also think that we should use AI more systematically. Technology, to me, always has this kind of relationship like we are in charge of it. We can control the technology. And of course, this has not been the case, and it's been written about and all of that. But I do think that with AI, we're in a different moment when it's kind of going to replace us if we're not careful. And so embracing it in a way that is not simply a replication of what we do, because that replication will also mean that we will rely on it for decision making. And so the reciprocities between AI, us, non-human, the buildings, vegetation, all of that is a different ballgame than just us and technology. So I think the terms of the game today with AI are very interesting because we think about like AI and how people write essays, but it's not that. It's now a different thing in terms of how you imagine with the help or in collaboration or something with sort of technology. And related to this, to your point about history, is that it's interesting how the historians and the philosophers often are reminding us of these things a long time ago. So it's people like Sloterdijk or many others who have really talked about this new relationality. They were discussing it before there was AI. I mean, there was no AI, but they understood the tensions between humans, non-humans, and new kinds of environments that we need to create with, let's say, networks. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of like reading philosophy or listening to history or something like that
And I
as
would
part of your
add,
future.
I agree, Mohsen, and I would add simply for all our incoming students, don't rely on AI. Knowingly interact with it, right? There's a huge difference there. Gary.
So this is non sequitur, but back to your question about the uses of history. It's been amazing to me to stand in front of these big images of absolutist places, right? And we don't tend to have that on the walls these days, but we live in a time when we are all afraid of absolutism. And we just need to understand. I mean, there was many beautiful things, and there was a lot of despotism, right?
Which
And we
is
should
why
think-
perhaps the frontispiece to Hobbes's treatise should have been included as well, right? It is territorial in scope.
And we have to think about the labor that produced these places. And, this is something now that, we have to see completely differently. So, again, hats off to, bringing that forward in a historical frame.
Ali.
And perhaps we might be able to see the question of nature and this exhibition as a proxy to two important topics that are now facing us and we have to deal with today, right? One is climate change, right? And the other one is what you said, and I started with in terms of the discussion that's related to AI and data and what have you. Those are moving so fast, and those are going to be changing the way that we're thinking about buildings and cities in different ways, and nature is definitely connected to those two topics.
And we have to add environmental justice in that, Ali. This is extremely crucial, and I think there's a lot of good work going on in this school on that topic. It too really is one of our great challenges.
So I think in the time that remains, what I'd like to do is actually turn to the audience and give us a chance to hear some of your questions as well. So. Hi. Oh, and make sure to say your name, just so we know who you are.
Yeah. Hi, I'm John. I'm an incoming MArc 1 student. I was wondering what you thought of something like the seawall being built in New York City, and whether or not this is something like the future or it's another piece of technology that might have a false promise, and how landscape changes as we might develop a more antagonistic relationship with nature in the city.
Your question is whether we should live with water or armor ourselves against it. Yeah. I'm on the side of live with water. And if we have to migrate, we have to migrate. That's very hard to accept for people who have been invested in places for generations. But it has to be done. And I think there's really great literature on that. And we have studied that in our department quite a lot, and I know thesis projects in the other departments as well. Armoring the coast is probably the right answer in a few places, not Wagner Park.
Before, perhaps also just following up on that, I think we might be also needing to think about the root cause of why we needed these technologies at the first place, right? That's why we are here at Schools of Designs, where responsibility becomes important in terms of how we're going to be thinking about designing new buildings and new cities that takes into consideration those issues in the first place. So there's an issue of mitigation, right, which is what you're alluding to, but there are also issues that needs to be considered early on in terms of our responsibilities to the built environment.
Congratulations, Antoine. Charles Waldheim down here. Thanks, Erika. Thanks to the panelists. wonderful exhibition. Looking forward to reading the book in English, forthcoming. I'd be interested to hear from any of you about the implications of this view of history or revision of history for disciplinary and professional formation. Gary closed with a call that it all is subsumed under landscape architecture, and my historian friends kind of looked askance at that, right? It's been mentioned, ecological urbanism 16 years ago, landscape urbanism now a decade before that. In both of those projects, there were implied kind of restructurings or realignments that disciplines and professions might respond to this new reading. And so far, we haven't really touched on that. And I wonder if there's any implication here for the way in which our professions are organized or the way in which our disciplines are organized in a school such as ours.
Thank you for that question, Charles.
Plant.
I think there are different ways of sort of answering that question. I suppose when I said that institutions have very short memory is a little bit connected to that. Because what do you have to do within the context of an institution to put certain ideas, certain kind of social contract on the table in order for it to have some level of kind of recognition. And I think all you can do is really to try and be as persuasive as possible. And you can also try to influence that indirectly and sometimes directly. But ultimately, it's a question of the certain structural receptivity of the institution to different ideas. And one thing that I would say, and I'm saying it very carefully because you asked a really horrible question. No, it's a hard question. No, if you want to, no, because I think if you want to answer it properly, you have to really deal with the fact that different institutions, there are certain mechanisms where it's actually difficult to introduce certain ideas because of the fact that we do have specific disciplinary conditions that have their own genealogy, their own history, their own methodology, their own approval procedures and processes. And sometimes you need a kind of radical transformation, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So I think that that's part of the response. But I also think that the situation has radically changed. I mean, there is an incredible level of similar thinking that is going on in terms of the relationship to the environment and the perception of the environment more generally, the idea of cross-disciplinary practices, the fact that we have to work together, and all of these things. But I suppose the reason I say you are asking a difficult question is that I think there is a certain sense of regret where you have an exhibition like this. In a way, it would be good if there was a mechanism of discussing the kind of pros and cons and what can we learn from this, and then enact on some of those situations. But I think the nature of learning from exhibitions or from panels or from these kinds of things is much more implicit than explicit. But on reflection, because I was thinking about this, if you think about what was landscape urbanism, what was landscape urbanism in London, what was landscape urbanism in Chicago, how did it move towards, I mean, there is a certain sort of history, and there's a history of certain, hurdles, in a way, at the same time. And I think you have to think about that. I think it's not always so easy with practice to, for example, create these moments of collaboration. I would welcome your recommendations or thoughts how it might be done.
And I think that we have to wrap it up, but this is obviously a sort of parenthetical, but it was inspired by your hard question. I think places like this, like the GSD, where in one building you have all the professional programs and advanced studies and doctoral students, it actually changes the way we write history. This kind of exhibit wouldn't sit well necessarily in a traditional museum. And I've seen in the work of our graduate students very different kinds of histories. I'm thinking of Alec Bierig, who's actually now an assistant professor at Toronto, for example, who wrote a kind of an architectural, economic, and spatial history of the coal industry from the 17th century to the mid-19th century, right? I mean, this is only a problem or a sort of vantage that could have come out from a place like this. So as much as history likes to lurk in the fringes, I would say that also the professions have changed the way we think about history itself. Ali, did you want to say something? And
just one quick thing. I had the pleasure of reading the book yesterday on my way back to the US. Was the English version, which is going to be coming soon, not the French version. And it's, in a way, it's, of course, what you see in the exhibition are snapshots of those ideas. But I think it's wonderfully written in many different ways. It's research, which is what we do here at the GSD in many different ways. The research, the historical research, but it's the blend of the different ideas from the point of view of history, theory, as well as technology in one book. So I'm looking forward to see the English version coming to the general public. And again, congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful exhibition.
And I want to thank our panelists and welcome you all to the GSD.